What an honor and a pleasure and a thrill to be not only here in this kind of amazing space, but here with you.
It's been a long journey. We've been planning, Josh and Lucy and I have been planning this for a long time, both what I wanted to publish from the book and then this conversation. And they said, "Who do you want?" And I said, "Leslie Jamison."
Well, I can already, I have lots to say and ask about this book, which is truly extraordinary. I imagine some of you have read it. Maybe some of you haven't. You all should, but you're all already living it, whether you thought about it or not, because it is about this primal part of who we are. And in that way and other ways, I could tell early on in reading it that it was one of those books that was going to kind of rearrange me and also stay with me in all these ways that I was maybe aware of. Oh, this is like shaping how I think about self-encountering worlds, but also all these ways that I don't even know yet. Like I can already foresee that there are these moments where I'm going to think about something in this book and it's going to lens whatever moment I'm living in some different way. So I'm excited for that for myself and grateful for that, and also excited for all of you for the ways that some of the ideas that Jamieson and some of the redescribing that you're doing here and kind of the opening these doors in what we already live to help us see it differently. I'm excited for the ways that that's going to kind of move with us and in us and go in 1,000 different directions for each of us. I mean, it just feels like one of those books that kind of gets inside you and becomes part of your living, so thank you for that.
It's also the reason for the later portion of the event, which is to get into this embodied experience of breathing together. Yeah.
Well, so I was just going to say a few words about some of what I was taking out of this book, and then we'll just get right into it, if that sounds good.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So I was struck by the ways that, this is a book about breathing. This book seemed to me like so kind of love affair with the world, not that there's not darkness and difficulty and struggle in it, but there's a feeling of exuberance and motion and energetic curiosity in this book. It's about free diving, pulmonauts, first breaths, last breaths, kids walking around putting things in their parents' laps. It goes around putting things in our laps. It's about cigarettes, inhalers, losing gills, losing people, sharing air, sharing grief, rediscovering a variety of things that maybe we have forgotten. At a certain point, I'll show you guys, I just started making a list of all the awesome shit this book is about. Glossolalia, ventilators, erotic auto-asphyxiation, hiccups. I've been obsessed with hiccups my whole life, and I've never had the chance to talk about them before, so we're definitely going to get there. It moves freely, vaporously, but like breath, this book always returns to the body. And throughout, to me, the prose felt animated by breathing in terms of form as well as content. Through these pages, I felt what Jamieson quotes Leo Bersani as calling our, quote, inescapable receptivity, the dual rhythm of absorbing from the world and expulsion, putting back, taking things in and putting them back out. This book does that too. It puts the familiar back out, newly glistening, newly held, redescribed, seen from a different angle. So I want to start with a moment very early on, where you say, if one of the main claims of psychoanalysis is that we forget sexuality, I think we must add breathing to our list of amnesias. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how we have forgotten breathing. Both maybe how psychoanalysis has forgotten breathing, but also maybe how all of us, part of what it means to breathe is to do so without always thinking about the fact that we're breathing. And in some ways that's can be seen as like the ideal way of breathing, to not be aware of doing it. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how we've forgotten breathing, thinking about that we, however you want, and then what it means to unforget it, to reclaim it in some way.
I think the moment for me was those videos during COVID where they kept showing people coughing and they'd have those laser lights that show the wafting and they were trying to show you how far it travels. And obviously we were all in a question of this collective spreading of the virus and the pathogen through our breath. But this need to visualize it, this sort of like obsessive need to see it and understand, where we might share the air as if this is not obvious to us. And then they do these maps, here was the person coughing, and then here are the tables that were infected in the room. And I'm like, what are we looking at here that we can't understand? And then, of course, I was in the hospital working as a palliative care person. And the fear of breath, not just in relationship to getting contaminated, but there was something more about it. There was some deep anxiety that I was feeling in relationship to the question of the patients and their struggle to breathe that sort of put a question in my mind. And from there, the research into the history of psychoanalysis was such that it was always there. You think of Freud smoking cigars even past 30 surgeries on his mouth and endless oral cancer, and he said, I'm just not going to stop smoking. But also the first patient that he writes a case about, Dora, if for those of you who don't know, had what he called tussis nervosa, which was a little neurotic cough, sort of kind of like And he liked it because it was little. It wasn't the sort of grand epileptic gestures of the hysterics in the hospital. It was these little symptoms. And there's another patient who smelt burnt pudding all the time. So I got very curious about the small breathing symptoms that appeared throughout the history of psychoanalysis, including questions of asthma or autistic children who like to see their breath in balloons and bubbles and were sort of interested in this envelopment of themselves with their own breathing and sound making, and how this hadn't become a part of the theory more generally. And Lacan, who, if he ever got something under his skin, he went at it, asked the question, should there or should there not be a question of a respiratory drive in psychoanalysis, and then dropped it completely. He never returned to it. So I felt this way in which we had to kind of come back to it, along with the fact that it was returning in the form of wellness therapies, sort of rampant in terms of breathing and breath work and somatic experiencing, and wondering what it meant for, at this moment in time, to come back to it so fulsomely, with the idea that we have forgotten it and how we forget it.
Well, and one of the things I think this is a question that brings together what you were just saying about the ways in which wellness culture has sort of reintroduced a certain kind of awareness of breathing, and also how COVID made breathing more visible to us. I mean, literally visible in those kinds of videos and visuals and diagrams that you're describing, where the particulates are getting mapped in terms of their danger zone. I always thought of it in terms of when you go to SeaWorld, if you sit in the first 3 rows, you're in the splash zone, we were all very perilously in each other's splash zones. But the fact that breathing was made visible, but in terms of danger and self-protection, or even, consider yourself a vector of danger. But one of the things I loved about this book is you have quite a bit to say about wellness culture, and I'll let you say it. But one of the observations I really appreciated was that there's this way that breathing can be talked about so much in terms of the self in wellness culture. It's a way to come back to the self. It's a way to ground in the self. It's there's something very inward about it as this instrument of self-actualization or self-optimization. But you're much more interested in breathing as a way to think about and consider all sorts of forms of interconnectedness and interdependence. And so I wonder if you could think about, and not thinking about interdependence in terms of peril, it's possible for us all to infect each other because we share air, but okay, what's the other side of that? And in a way, what's the other side of wellness? If we think about breath not in terms of just the self doing the breathing, and if we're going to think about interconnectedness not just in terms of peril, how does breathing help us think about interrelation, really, and sharing air as a way of thinking about what we share? How can breathing be a way of thinking about actually kind of the opposite of solipsism? I mean, the primal encounter between self and everything it's not.
Everything else. No, that was where I wanted to steer the book, was to the question of the interconnectedness of breath that was made visible, and then I think immediately pushed down in ways in which we're still reeling and experiencing that. I think there's a moment in which we thought, oh, well, here we are all together sharing the same air. Here is a disease that has traveled the entire globe. What does that mean for us? But it's meant a kind of meanness more than it has a sense of what we're all in together. And I think that's, the person who I would credit the most for this insight is the philosopher Luce Irigaray, because she wrote a book against the male philosophers who were very much about, my life, my death, my sort of existential question of my existence. And she wrote a book called On the Forgetting of Air and To Be Two. And she sort of said, what you guys forgot about in your obsession with death was the question of life and sharing and air and togetherness. And this was sort of her kick at the whole field of philosophy, which I really, really, it's a great book and I really loved it. And I think psychoanalysis, in the ways in which I would like it not to be thought about as a kind of navel-gazing enterprise about, my life, my narrative, my story, I wanted to push it in this direction, especially the way in which I think that we also have to consider that breathing is speaking. And breathing is the speaking that we only do in relationship to another, in relationship to a language that's always a bit foreign to us, and with one another. And that the question of speaking together, speaking to one another is absolutely critical at this moment in time, as if we need to figure out how to do it again.
Well, and I think thinking about, I'm fascinated by that way that it's an idea that plays out in these pages, but I'm also curious to hear you talk about it more. This idea that breathing, or thinking about both maybe the rhythms of breathing and the textures and sensations of breathing, but also the sort of primary dual nature of breathing that's present in that Bersani quote, but taking things in and putting them out again, and always being in some kind of encounter with what you're not, always literally holding some of the world as not you inside of you. I'm wondering how breathing can offer a different relationship to narrative that pushes back against that kind of rigidity that you're interested in resisting. At one point you say to you psychoanalysis is more like lyric than narrative, and part of that I think is a resistance to this kind of desire to come to the rigid codified my story, this is my story, this is who I am. So I wonder, to you, how can breathing, kind of considering breathing in all these ways, visceral, somatic ways, kind of more existential, self not self ways, how does breathing offer us different ways to relate to storytelling, the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, the stories we tell others about ourselves, the stories we tell our rescue listeners? At one point you talk about the analyst as a kind of rescue listener who is there to receive. So yeah, how can breathing help us into a more kind of oxygenated relationship with story?
My experience in analysis, both as a patient and as a listener, is that the most magical moments, and this was Freud's idea with the slip of the tongue, is that you're there in your story, you're there in the this is what I need to say today, and then it just goes off the rails from what your expectation was, and it happens at a move in the train track, as if, the signal just switched you onto another track, and you can't believe that this whole other domain opened up. And it happens in a moment of a confusion or a mistake or a mishearing or a strange piece of language that emerges. And what this does for the need that we have to grip ourselves, onto ourselves, I think is the quasi-miraculous aspect of psychoanalysis. That it just, in the book I call it opening up a pocket, a breathing space that you didn't know was there. Which I love also from the breathwork practices, when they say that you're trying to breathe into the dead space in your lungs, that there are spaces in your lungs in which we forget to push breath into or remove whatever's blocked there, so that some room opens up. And the analyst themselves has to learn a completely different repertoire of listening. It's often to get out of common sense. It's to get out of the relentless need to understand what another person's saying, to get out from the demand that the other person has upon you, that you understand what they're saying. And what then becomes possible between two people? How you allow something to wash over you and hear something different and have the other person hear this difference that you're trying to introduce, for me is really important. And I feel as if we're very constrained at this moment in terms of getting things right and being understood and having things, fact-checked, as it were. And so there's something about this, and this is really difficult when you're writing, is to say, how do you make the writing reflect that? How do you bring this not just into a book that explains something that you're trying to talk about is beyond explanation and understanding, but have the writing work in that direction as well? And I was saying we did a talk on poetry and psychoanalysis that I had all these poems that I loved that were about breathing, but I wasn't going to use them to decorate my book. And I certainly wasn't going to explain them. And it became like a shadow book that I just put to the side and then figured out how all of this writing about breath that I loved could infect the writing, as it were. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, and so I have so many questions about dead spaces and how narrative seeks them out. As you were talking about that, I was could feel my own breathing. I was like, I'm trying to breathe into my dead spaces and find them. But I'm going to ask you something about what you just said first, which is, how did that shadow book end up infecting, which is also a kind of a beautiful rehabilitation of infection, or the kind of transmission qualities of infection. How did that infect this book? And also how did you, in writing this book, how did you kind of help it or let it or find it? I don't know how much agency feels right to you to kind of put onto the process, but how did you let it kind of gather some of those rhythms of feeling a little bit less constrained or a little bit less anchored by the solid conclusion or the solid narrative? And maybe a simpler way of asking this is just kind of, how did you find and write your way towards its form, its structure?
I mean, there's a life trajectory behind the book that's reversed kind of in order. So one, it was working in palliative care, so this experience of breath and death. And then it was the birth of my daughter, and then it was the death of my father. But the book starts with the birth of my daughter, then reflects on COVID, and then sort of moves towards the death of my father. So it's all sort of wiggled around, in part because they said nobody wants a COVID book. And I was like, okay, fine, nobody wants a COVID book. But also it made sense. It made sense in a way to start at the beginning. The other thing about the writing of it was that I wanted to find what was weird about breathing. This was very important, was to find the weird and the staccato and the kind of strange hodgepodge montage that I want to think of as the science of breathing and the history of evolution. So reading all of these scientific papers about evolution of the body, from when we were in the sea to when we became mammals, to even dolphins and whales and how they crawled back into the sea and what happened to their breathing apparatuses and their noses. And then there's the weird stories in psychoanalysis, Freud and his mentor who were obsessed with nasal menstruation, and Freud's operations that he had on his nose to cure his depression. I mean, to grab all of these strange ephemera from the history of psychoanalysis. And then it was a very communal process writing this book. My editor was with me every step of the way. I don't know why he decided to do this. I thought that I was a little challenged. He's like, I really want to see the next chapter by, in 2 weeks. And I'd be like, okay. And then he'd be like, okay, well, I'm going to edit it, and then I'm going to send it back, and then I want your notes in another week. And I'd be like, okay. But it was really, I loved this. I mean, it was really we did this together. And then I had my teaching assistant and my research assistant, Kaysen, hi Kaysen. We had a crazy Google Doc, and we read everything. So it really had this very communal aspect.
Well, and there's something about that editorial rhythm of back and forth that actually has that same kind of that same sort of dual structure to it of expelling and then absorbing and expelling and absorbing. I mean, it's what you've been saying about also being interested in these moments of glitch or disruption, both in the analytic process, slips of the tongue, those moments where you sort of go in thinking you're going to talk about one thing, and then the parenthetical sort of becomes the world of the conversation, or you sort of go off onto some totally different track. And then thinking about these sort of that glitches or disruptions in breathing are often moments when we become aware of it, right? Like it's kind of hiccup theory or something like that. Yeah. Like how does the thing become visible in its disruption? Or I can't remember who it was who said we only notice a doorknob when it doesn't work. Yeah. But that I wonder kind of if you could talk us through a little bit what you think we can learn from those moments of experiences of disrupted breathing, which are often experiences of anxiety or panic. I mean, in an asthma attack or, COVID as like an extreme example. I mean, moments where it's hard to breathe. There's such a primal panic, and one of the things you articulate so beautifully about free diving is that it involves really a psychological process of mastering or coming into relation with a certain kind of panic that's not being overwhelmed by it. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about like what waits for us in moments of disruption, constriction, panic, anxiety, where our breathing becomes so physically, viscerally present for us because it's not working for us in the ways that it usually does. And what do those moments illuminate, or what can they illuminate?
This medical ethicist, I thought actually a lot about this claim, was saying that the trouble with breathing is other things like pain or different forms of disability. With breathing, it's every second, it's second by second. And that so you're put in relationship to the disability in a way that you can't get away from. And that this is what is so anxiety-inducing and helplessness-making about struggling to breathe. And then there's an amazing quote by Proust's caretaker, who said that he looked like he was husbanding himself, like husbanding his strength, and it gave him a kind of elegance, as if like his whole being, his whole presentation was to put himself together because of the struggles that he had breathing, as if he had to like put a beautiful package around himself because of the rest of the ways in which he struggled with breathing his whole life. And so I think I thought a lot about that idea of having to be present to your own difficulty without any escape. And it's very much a part also of the philosopher Sloterdijk, who says that with the kinds of attacks on the environment, whether it's climate change or whether it's the kind of terroristic wars that attack your capacity to live in an environment and functions like breathing, you are made a part of your own demise in a way that is obscene. And so like collectively thinking of all of us together in this kind of constant glitch and disruption, not just the person who has a panic attack, but the ways in which we're all having minor panic attacks all the time, or we're all present with the question of how do we participate in our own demise every time you put your recycling out and freak out. So this was a big part of the book on the level of the body and breathing, and then on the level of our collective existence together. And that on the one hand is the scary side, right? I mean, that's the scary side of what it means to wrestle with this glitch that we're all a part of. The other side of it is what's ecstatic, and you can't separate these two. I mean, I think that that's what becomes so complicated in the book, is that the glitch is also the possibility. And this is true as a psychoanalyst, of course. Right? I mean, it's both at the place of the greatest pain, the most nonsensical aspects of the pain of our life, that there is the possibility then of doing something there. And holding to that, not just saying like this is bad and this is good, but understanding the way in which that they're completely interconnected. And it was, this is what I loved about the book, was the way that it drove into this really impossible space. And I wanted it to, because I read a lot of books about how great breathing is, and I think it's great. But I wasn't going to write that. I wasn't going to write that book.
Well, and there's some things. I mean, yeah, I'm so glad you wrote exactly the book that you did, and thinking about kind of what forms of presence maybe await us inside of glitch or disruption connects to me to this idea that was emerging for me as I was reading this about the ways in which breathing is, of course, both spatial and temporal. I mean, it's spatial in this way that even those diagrams that you were alluding to at first sort of demonstrate that like something comes into us and then it goes outside of us again and it sort of spreads around, and what we're taking into us at any given moment is collected from all of these infinitudes, from the larger world. But it's also temporal. It's a way, I mean, breath is a sort of primal unit of poetic time, poetic meter. It's there's a kind of metronome quality to breathing. And even in terms of the glitch, I mean, there's I guess this is a kind of bastardized wellness practice or something, but an idea that has come to me particularly through recovery, although there's nothing monopolized by recovery about it, is this idea of sort of at any given moment, you could just take 3 deep breaths. And it's a way of, well, it's probably a way of doing a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But part of what it is for me is a way of sort of inviting myself to step outside of proximity for a second, like the urgency of like I have to respond to this person's need in exactly this way to make them feel okay in this moment, or this feeling of being not enough or unloved or whatever is like so overwhelming to my psyche. There's no outside to it. The present is eternal. All these delusions that are just like part of being alive for me, right? Like that 3 deep breaths is a way temporally to sort of like interrupt the matrix or whatever, and then see some, just like have a possibility of like touching something bigger or more surprising. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, I guess, how for you, thinking about either the chronology of this book in terms of those life beats that you were talking about, birth, kind of collective death, and then more personal death, the virus, and then your father's death, how you sort of thought about a reader's experience of temporality moving through this book, like what sort of, what shape this book has in your mind, or what sort of arc you imagine taking a reader on, or what kind of company you wanted to provide to a reader along the way. And then a kind of corollary question, like what were, in the vein of glitches, like what were the ways that this book ended up surprising you or taking some turn that was different from what you expected, whether that was from the course of following it yourself, or whether that also came from conversations you were having with your editor or others about reading it? Sort of like what were the moments of glitch or off-courseness that came editorially for you in putting this together?
I like the 3 deep breaths. No, there's a section. It's first breaths, anxiety, asphyxiation, last words. Is basically how the book is divided. And the anxiety was very important because I was wrestling with the question or the trouble. One, that I think we live in an age of anxiety, and my patients speak more about anxiety than I've ever heard in the 20-something years that I've been practicing. And wondering about that, and wondering about anxiety, also because I think I have a funny relationship to anxiety, where I don't have so much like of a conscious rumination. It surprises me and goes away, and surprises me and goes away. But some people have they live with anxiety all the time. And so I find this curious in its difference. And Freud was very worried about anxiety. He's very worried because he on the one hand feels like civilization should be held responsible for providing us with enough of a cushion so that we're not overwhelmed by anxiety, because anxiety leads to illness, basically, whether psychic or physiological or both. So the solution to anxiety is actually symptomatic neurosis in Freud, which is a very funny thing. The treatment of anxiety is to develop a symptom. And you see this because the anxiety, if you have like what they call today generalized anxiety disorder, which I think we all have, the solution to a generalized anxiety disorder is actually a phobia, a specific phobia, because it treats the anxiety by giving it an object. So if you're just anxious all the time, like, what if I die? How can you live, right? But if you say, well, what if I die by spider bite? Many possibilities for life are possible. And the correlate of that in Freud was symptoms more generally, the way in which a symptom allows you to live, even the symptoms that we like to think of as our creativity or artistic processes, which are completely symptomatic, as any of us who have an artistic practice know that we're crazy people in our arts. But it's how you live. It's what you do. It's how you can make your life kind of around it. And so are we losing our symptoms was my question. And I think that this brought me to, I think, some of the surprising moments in my life, which the book drives towards, which is to speak about the only symptom or new symptom that I developed in my psychoanalysis, which I call a language symptom or a language tic, and to think about what that tic was about. And the way that I would describe it is kind of confronting an impossibility in myself that's not unlike the algorithms online that affect us, which is some feeling sometimes that I only want to hear what I want to fucking hear, and I don't want to hear anything else that I don't want to hear. And that what I don't want to hear is absolutely unbearable to me, to the point of wanting to put my hands in my ears and scream. And then you think, well, how can this person be a professional listener? No, really. And some wrestling with that, both what my own history in relationship to language and voices and things that I don't want to hear informed my desire to be someone who listened, but also what I had to confront in that. And like a scenes of violence in language. Yeah.
Well, and thinking about the kind of the unbearable nature or quality of hearing what you don't want to hear, I mean, makes me think about the kind of, I guess, the terror or helplessness or inescapable receptivity involved in breathing itself, that we have no choice but to take in the world kind of constantly, and we actually don't have, I mean, there's a kind of a contamination anxiety around it too. We can't control what it is we're taking in when we're taking in the world. So there's a kind of confrontation. There's a confrontation with something difficult in that kind of, in the involuntariness of like, and I think about that with like the difference between certain senses, like sight. We choose where to direct our gaze more fully than we choose what to hear or not. You're in less control of it in that sense. I mean, thinking,
and you can close your eyes.
Yes, yeah.
You have to do something extreme to not. Want to.
Yeah. Well, and it's I mean, this is just like a brief parenthetical, but when I watch scary movies, I have found that I can tolerate moments of frightening moments if I block one of my senses or the other. Like if I block my eyes and I'm just listening, it's bearable, and if I block my ears, I'm just watching. But somehow having both at once is like, I'm too fully subject. I will definitely be killed by the serial killer or the shark or whatever it is, so
my partner who's here always goes, "It's just a movie," because I'm like,
I'm right there with you, blocking, being one of the monkeys. But I wonder, I mean, that there's a riff on nightmares in the book that feels connected both to like what's unbearable and maybe to this question of what dwells waiting for us and what we fear the most, or how we kind of seek out in various ways the very things that are most difficult to us. But you talk and write in really lucid and to me helpful ways about how we can find our desires in our nightmares. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about how you think about the relationship between nightmare and desire, fear and desire, and how breathing kind of takes us close to both fear and desire. I mean, I think it's connected to what you're saying about, it's like the terror of breathing, but also there's something about exhilaration and wonder that's very close to the pulse of this book too.
It's very hard to recommend nightmares, but I recommend them highly. No, I mean, I think I mentioned in the book that I have patients who sometimes tell me that they'd rather take sleep medications and not dream in order to avoid their nightmares. But actually working on the nightmare is incredibly important, because if you take Freud seriously, which I do, there's a wish in there there's pleasure in there, there's excitement in there, there's ecstasy in there, as much as there is all of the other embodied aspects of absolute terror and, sort of nightmarish confrontation with fragility and helplessness and everything that can go wrong in a life. And nightmares are incredible to the extent in which they just throw in your face all of the things that can just go wrong. I mean, you walk, trip, something falls on your head. I mean, it has that kind of slapstick character. Or it's just, the sort of serial killer disembodied body, dismembered body, right in the flesh. And I thought of the moment when you wake up from the nightmare where you're like, it's usually at that place of the absolute gasp for breath that you then, sort of emerge from the nightmare. Whereas the idea is that usually you're fulfilling a wish and you get to sleep nicely and soundly without too much of what's underneath that wish or problematic about that wish disturbing your sleep. So Freud said that the nightmare is a failed dream, but it's still a dream. And so when you work on a nightmare as an analyst in analysis, you turn it inside out like a glove. You find the tenderness in it. You find the wish. You find the whole other repertoire inside of it. The idea originally was that you have to work it through and work out the childhood scenes that it's connected with and the repressed memories. I think that that's also part of it. But in doing that, actually what you do is you find the other language in it. And we all need to do that work somehow, yeah.
Well, and in that vein of kind of turning things inside out, I love that metaphor of turning it inside out like a glove and sort of finding that, the soft shearling inside of it. And I wonder if you could do something similar with shame. I mean, maybe this is just me asking you to turn my shame inside out. But one of the things that I loved about this book, and one of the things that I think I read and live for generally and speak to other human beings for, is finding some new relationship to shame, or finding what my shame has been trying to point me towards, or why it's trying to get my attention. And in some of your writing here about mouth breathing, I was invited to consider some shames I did not even know I had around being a mouth breather, where it's like, I think in a way that I had never consciously interrogated, I think I had really internalized a sense of being a bit of an animal for being, just like I don't really breathe through my nose. I have a really complicated history with my nose, but it's like this idea that I'm somebody who really breathes through my mouth a lot. And then I was like, why am I so ashamed of this? It's like I need breath so much. I'm so hungry for it. It's connected to the ways I need everybody's attention and always want dessert and whatever. But there was something about mouth breathing that was suddenly that was the word that was holding everything I hated about myself. But this is a question about how you see the relationship between breathing and shame, because I think breathing is to be a breather is to be in a state of constant and unending need, which is for many people, myself included, connected to shame, the shame of needing anything, the shame of needing from the world, the shame of needing from other people. But both sort of what is in particular thinking about breathing, kind of what does it illuminate about shame, and then how can sort of the forms of presence that breathing invites us into, or being present in our own bodies, which is kind of unbearable, I think, if you have a lot of shame, but also being present in this constant space and exchange between self and world that can also bring up all sorts of forms of shame. So what can breathing tell us about shame?
This is a beautiful example from Winnicott of a child who was oxygen was explained to her. And he said she seized on it immediately with the idea that she needed more of it, which I love. It's so beautiful. And I'm also a mouth breather, and then I have to worry about my breath and the smell of my breath all the time, and you wake up with this and there's an amazing moment in the book at which at what point this went viral on the internet, but this idea that civilization has, there's a whole incel world of mouth taping men who, want to get their masculine features back, of which they blame civilization for turning us into mouth breathers. The more interesting question is we're all moving in the direction of mouth breathing. What is this about? And there's all these like anthropological theories about when our palates disintegrated 300 years ago when we transitioned from, eating a certain kind of food to not eating that food anymore. So they want to eat a lot of beef jerky so that they can chew all of the time and, tape their mouths. But that's going in the other direction than the shame, although you hear the shame-riddenness about it. And the shame of living in this civilization at this moment in the way that it impacts our bodies, we could experience more collectively than in the way in which we experience this shame alone, as if something wrong has been done to us or that we do something wrong. And I think that to open that dimension back up in which we ask about our collective conditions without needing to travel backwards to a nostalgia of whatever the authentic, right working person is. And, in psychoanalysis, what it does for me so well is if we're going to add breathing to all of the other erogenous zones, the oral, the anal, the genital, the visual, and the acoustic, and breathing seems to do some fascinating work between the oral and the acoustic and the genital, by the way, because there's a lot of breathing with the sex and the spasms and the diaphragm and the esophagus. So it seems to pull a lot of them together. Is the way in which there's no natural object, there's no natural rhythm, it's just confusion. We don't know how much to eat. Going to the bathroom is strange. We do weird things around it. Sex is confusing. Breathing too. Yeah. For me, psychoanalysis goes there and it says there's nothing natural, there's nothing normal. And then that's an invitation. It's an invitation to everybody. What would you like to do with it? Which is an invitation to work with your shame. And Lacan, it's his birthday, he preferred shame to guilt. And this made many, many analysts angry because they see guilt as like the epitome of like the civilizing forces, like you need to think about your actions and you be guilty, and it has a kind of religious quality to it. You were born guilty. But he liked shame because he felt it was very, very close to the body. And he felt that, like a lot of people are depicted in paintings with their eyes turned down to talk about their sense of shame, but also humility. And I think that he felt like a humility could be born of the fragility of the body and of the difficulty of the sexual life that we hold in our bodies. Yeah.
I love, it does feel close to the body, and I love those, those thoughts and those invitations. I wonder, maybe in that vein of like forging different relations to ourselves and our breath and embracing it as a space of confusion and not one right wayness. Maybe if you wanted to tell us a little bit about what's happening next, what we're all invited today. I mean, not just in the scale of the world, but literally in this room, what we're all going to be part of as a way of helping us transition into it.
So I'm really excited. I participated with Andros Sims-Brown. I participated with his Chaos Opera, and I immediately put a bookmark on it. And I think that this could be very important to me in the future. And I think at every book event I've done, we were just talking about books and how hard they are and what you want from them and what's terrible to want from them. But I always want to do something together and participatory, and we all love that and we all hate it. And so to put us all through that together. And so with every book I've wanted to do something participatory. So with the conversion disorder book, I did an 80-person field hospital in a limousine garage in Harlem. And it was kind of the experience of the hell of the bureaucracy of hospitals and the strangeness. We did speed dating analysts. They had this bell that would go off. You'd get 10 minutes and then you'd shuffle around a cot. And then at the end, everyone was clapped into health, which I really loved. And then in the last book, Disorganization and Sex, we took over a public space. And then we did the talk, which you had to do on your phone to respect the sharedness of the space that we took over. That was with Fiona Duncan. And so I have put in Andros's hands what this participatory experience, which is where the end of the book goes, because it's a question of breathing and speaking and listening and dissonance and trying to do something together that's not the same thing. Which, by the way, is often the experience in yoga, for example, like, let's all take a deep breath together. But Andras does some wild stuff in his chaos opera, and so I knew that it was the absolutely sort of perfect experience for this book. So do you want to give them a housekeeping transitional moment?
Yeah, I would love to. I don't want to, you didn't get to talk about hiccups yet, so I didn't want to deprive you of the opportunity.
All right, let's do a little postscript on hiccups.
Yeah, we need to know about your obsession, your life obsession.
Well, obsession makes it sound like something with more age. I mean, maybe obsession never feels like it has agency. Hiccups have found me anywhere and everywhere. I loved, actually, the anecdote of my partner having hiccups for 3 days straight, because I was like, okay, there's a moment in the book where somebody has hiccups for 3 days straight. I've always felt some shame around hiccups because you're so not in control. And I also, like, when I used to drink, one of the things that would happen when I got really drunk was my hiccups would get really bad. And so it always felt like God was just like, you sinner, stop fucking drinking so much vodka. I'm going to give you hiccups again in this, like, dirty dive bar bathroom where you're trying to get away from your date, you know. But you helped me maybe think about hiccups less in terms of shame and more in expansion. I think it's actually very connected to what we were just talking about how shame can invite us. But if you maybe wanted to share a little bit about how we might all walk away from this room with a more expansive, curiosity about our hiccups.
Richard Brown got the hiccups for 3 days on our first date. I'm sorry, but I'm not sorry, because that I knew that it was the love of my life. So. In Aristophanes, just to transition us from Richard Brown to Aristophanes. In Aristophanes, it's the symposium, Plato's symposium. Aristophanes gets the hiccups in the middle of it. He has to give his speech on love, and instead he falls down on the ground, and he has the hiccups. And then he has to be removed, and they have to reshuffle the order of speakers. And I think it was Kojev said, the only way to understand Plato's Symposium is if we understand this bout of hiccups in the middle of it. And what's very, very funny is what actually comes to pass is that the person who's speaking right before he gets the hiccups is giving a version of love that Lacan calls capitalized shelterization, capitalizing your gains in love. And he says it must have cracked him up so much that he just died on the floor laughing. And then they bring the doctor in, and the doctor gives a version of love that's like the nice, neat, harmonious relationship in the body is like how a good relationship should be. Which is very funny with this guy who can't stop hiccuping in the background. And then he says the most serious talk then comes from Aristophanes, who says we are two parts of a circle that were cut in half, whose genitals were then sewn onto the front of us, and the only way to get back together is to try to stick these genitals together, and this is like a monstrous, strange sight, and that's love. So it's it's the way in which Lacan talks about it. He says it's deriding the sphere. There's no sphericity possible again, and I think the hiccups is a great example of that, right? I mean, it's like this thing that's sort of breaking whatever integrity you think you have, and they can be fun. No, I actually every time I smoke a cigarette when I haven't smoked in a while, I get the hiccups and it won't let me finish the cigarette. Mm-hmm. Thank you for reminding us of the hiccups, Andras.